The black Escalade came up the gravel road too fast for a road that ended at a lake, and the woman washing the dog never heard it, because she had earbuds in and she was singing badly, loudly, and with total conviction, the wrong words to a Fleetwood Mac song. It was 10:40 on a Friday morning in June, and Wesley Rourke had been driving alone since dawn, which he hadn't done in 19 years. No driver, no second car, no name on any registry between Albany and Mirror Lake, because for the next 90 days, Wesley Rourke wasn't supposed to exist. He killed the engine and stepped out onto the gravel in shoes that had never touched anything but marble, and the first thing he noticed was that the woman in the yard didn't know he was there. That was the part he couldn't process. Wesley had spent his whole adult life reading a room before he walked into it who was armed, who was lying, who'd break first. But this wasn't a room. It was a lawn and a garden hose, and a soaked 27-year-old in a t-shirt worn thin as tissue, up to her elbows in suds on the back of a black Neapolitan Mastiff the size of a calf. The dog sat like a statue with its eyes half closed. She danced, the soap flew. She was happier than anyone Wesley had met in a decade, and she was doing it for nobody at all. Then the dog opened its eyes. It didn't bark. It stood up, walked 4 steps, and planted itself squarely between Wesley and the woman, and Wesley understood, in that instant, that this animal had learned that move somewhere, from somebody, and that whatever it had learned it from, it hadn't been kind. She turned around. She pulled out an earbud. She looked at the Escalade, and then at the man, and then he watched her do it at his shoes, the Italian leather with no wear on the sole, and she tugged the left sleeve of her shirt down over her wrist. Wesley pulled the folded confirmation from his breast pocket and held it out the way a man hands over a court summons. Mirror Lake Estate, 14 Cutters Lane. June 6 through September 1st. She read it. She looked up. This is the wrong house. Mr. Rourke, he had a list of what men like him do next. So did she. They ask for the owner. They reach for the wallet. They drop a name you're supposed to be scared of. They make the wrong house your problem. Wesley Rourke did none of it. He looked at the dog. He turned the black steel signet ring on his left hand, one full rotation with his thumb, a small motion, almost private, and he said 4 words she hadn't heard from anyone in 4 years. May I wait outside? She hadn't expected to be asked. It did something to her spine she didn't want it to do, and neither of them said a word about the dark stain drying on his left sleeve. If you're already leaning in, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Share this with someone who loves a story that earns its ending. And subscribe, because you won't want to miss what's in that letter. Now let's get back to Mirror Lake, and the man on the steps, and the woman who told a mafia boss he was at the wrong house and wasn't wrong yet. At 12:05, Delaney called the real estate office in Saranac from the landline mounted on the kitchen wall, its coiled cord long enough for her to stand in the screen doorway and still keep the man sitting outside in view. The line was busy. She hung up, counted to 60, and called again. Still busy. She did it 4 more times, and each time she looked out into the yard, and each time he was still sitting in the same place on the lowest step, his elbows braced on his knees, his face turned toward the lake. He didn't tap at his phone. He didn't call anyone. Delaney had cleaned for enough wealthy people to know that this was the strangest thing about the entire morning, stranger even than the car. People with money didn't sit still. They called someone and turned the problem into somebody else's problem within 90 seconds. But he simply sat there, and Bruno lay 4 paces away from him, no closer and no farther, his massive head resting on his front paws, his eyes open. The dog didn't take his eyes off the man for 1 hour and 40 minutes. At 2:15, Bev Tanager finally answered, her voice broken and breathless, as though she'd just run in from the parking lot, and Delaney gave her name, the name of the house, and then read every line from the confirmation sheet the man had handed her. Bev fell silent for a long time. Then, in the voice of someone who had just looked over the edge of an abyss, she said there were 2 properties in the system, one called Mirror Lake Estate, and the other called Mirror Lake Lodge, and they were 31 miles apart by road and exactly 1 letter apart in name. Someone had typed it wrong. No one had checked it. The contract had been signed. The money had been transferred. And the paper in Delaney's hand was a completely valid confirmation for a house the guest had never rented. Delaney asked when they could get the keys to the other lodge. Bev said they didn't manage that property. It belonged to another agency in Lake Placid, and the person who kept the keys only worked beginning Monday, maybe Wednesday. maybe longer, because this was the first week of the season. Delaney asked about Mrs. Wick, whether Mrs. Wick knew what had happened, and Bev said Mrs. Priscilla Wick, 71 years old, was in Lisbon and wouldn't be back before September 1st, and that she'd made it very clear they weren't to call her unless the house was on fire. Delaney looked out into the yard. This wasn't a house fire. This was one letter. She passed the receiver through the screen doorway, and the man stood, walked 3 steps, took it from her, and thanked her before saying anything at all to Bev. Then he listened. Delaney went back into the kitchen, but she didn't go far, and she watched him through the screen, and this was what she remembered about that day more clearly than the car. He didn't pace. Wealthy men who paced were men preparing to shout. The ones who stood still were the ones who simply removed obstacles without ever needing to raise their voices. He stood like a pillar. His weight settled into one hip, and over the course of 11 minutes he spoke only 4 times, never more than 2 words at once. Not once did his voice rise above the sound of water lapping beneath the dock. At 2:26 he hung up, walked 3 steps back to the doorway, passed the receiver through the screen, and said they had confirmed the mistake, that they had offered to transport him to Lake Placid that evening at their expense, and that he had declined. Delaney waited for him to explain why. He didn't. He only asked her, very politely, whether she would mind if he sat there until dark. She told him the shade stayed on the east side until 3 o'clock. He thanked her and returned to the steps, and Bruno shifted with him, remaining exactly 4 paces away, no closer and no farther. Delaney set a pot on the stove. She had a pound of split peas, half an onion, and a ham bone she'd kept in the refrigerator since Sunday. She made pea soup the way she did every Friday, for 1 person, enough to last 3 days, because it was the cheapest way not to think about food again until Monday. She stirred the pot. She looked at the clock on the stove. 10 minutes to 3. Outside, the man who had arrived at the wrong house was still sitting on the lowest step with his back to her, and his shadow had stretched all the way to the edge of the lawn. And Delaney realized that during the past 2 hours, not once had she thought about telling him to leave. What Delaney didn't know, and what Wesley Rourke had been calculating during the 2 hours he sat on the lowest step, was that he couldn't go to Lake Placid that night or any other night, not because he didn't want to, but because the agency in Lake Placid would ask for a name. They would ask for a driver's license. They would photograph it with a phone and upload it to a cloud system that 3 different people could access, and within 48 hours someone in Albany would know that Wesley Rourke had been in Lake Placid on a Friday evening in June, and that name wasn't allowed to appear anywhere for 90 days. Not in a hotel, not in an inn, not in a single guest register, not on any camera with his name attached beneath the image. He had signed a paper in a room in Albany on Thursday night, and the paper didn't bear his signature anywhere, yet it bound him more tightly than any contract he had signed in 19 years. The terms were simple. He disappeared for 90 days. No name, no face, no trace. If he appeared, if there was a photograph, if there was a signature, then he wouldn't be the one who paid the price. His sister would. That was the entire agreement. That was why he had driven alone since dawn. That was why there was no driver and no second car. And that was why he was sitting on the steps of a woman he didn't know, listening to the water lap beneath the dock, understanding with perfect clarity that the doorway through which he might have left had closed at 2:26 that afternoon, when he passed the receiver back through the screen doorway. He took the confirmation sheet from his breast pocket and unfolded it for the 3rd time that day, and this time he saw what he hadn't seen the first 2 times. June 6th through September 1st. He counted. 90 days from June 6th was September 4th. He had booked 3 days too few. Wesley Rourke sat on the weathered cedar step and stared at that number for a long time, and he realized, with a sensation that was almost nausea, that this was the first time in his life he had ever arranged a place to stay for himself. For the past 19 years, someone else had done it. Someone knew which floor he preferred. Someone knew he couldn't eat seafood. Someone counted the days for him, and he had never once asked that person's name. And now he was sitting there with 3 missing days, on a sheet of paper he had created with his own click. 3 days that no one in the world was going to correct for him, and he understood that Bev Tanager's 1-letter mistake wasn't the only accident that had happened that day. At 3:45 he stood. The dog rose with him, still keeping exactly 4 paces away. Wesley walked to the screen doorway, and he didn't open it. He simply stood outside and waited until she looked up from the pot. He said he needed to stay. He said he couldn't explain why, and that he wouldn't lie to her, so he would tell her only the part of the truth he was permitted to tell, which was that there was an agreement, and that agreement required his name not to appear anywhere. People kept records for the next 90 days. No hotel, no rental house, no register of any kind. Delaney asked what would happen if he appeared. He said that if he appeared, he wouldn't be the one who paid the price. She waited for him to say more. He didn't. Then he named the amount, $80,000, for 90 days on those steps. He said it in exactly the same voice he had used when he thanked her for the telephone receiver. No louder, no softer, as though it were a fact about the weather. He said she could spend it on anything she wanted, and he wouldn't ask. He said she could say no, and he would sleep in his car somewhere without a name. And while he waited for her answer, Wesley Rourke stood perfectly still, his hands resting at his sides, not moving at all. And he realized this was the first time in 19 years he had named a number without already knowing what the answer would be. Delaney Pike earned $1,100 a month plus room and board, and she worked 6 days a week for a house she didn't own. And on the last 2 days of the week, she cleaned 3 more houses along the road that circled the lake. And she drove Mrs. Wick's pickup because she had a driver's license issued by the state of New York. But she didn't have a car and never had. $80,000 was 7 years. She made that calculation in the space of a single breath, because she had made that calculation with every number she had heard for the past 4 years, and she hated how quickly she did it. $80,000 was 7 years of her life standing outside the screen doorway, spoken in the voice of someone reading the weather forecast. She set the wooden spoon on the rim of the pot. She looked at him through the screen, and she said she didn't want his money. She said what she wanted to know was what had dried on the left sleeve of his shirt. Wesley Rourke didn't blink. He didn't look down at his arm, and that told her more than if he had, because it meant he had known exactly what she was talking about since 10:40 that morning, and he had spent 6 hours waiting to see whether she would mention it. He didn't answer. He stood there with his hands at his sides, and the two of them listened to the soup bubbling in the pot, and Delaney understood that she wasn't going to get an answer today, and perhaps never would. And she also understood that he didn't intend to lie to her, because a man who meant to lie would have done it already, would have had a story ready about a chainsaw or a carving knife or a fall, and he had nothing. He simply stood there and let her look. She turned away. She lowered the heat. She opened the cupboard above the sink and took down 2 bowls, and she had set them on the wooden counter and filled the first ladleful before she realized she had made her decision. That was how it happened. There was no moment when she sat down and waited. There were only 2 bowls on the wooden counter, and a woman standing there staring at them, as though someone else had just placed them there. She left the second bowl on the top step with a spoon and a slice of bread, and she didn't call to him, and she went back into the kitchen and didn't look outside. She heard the step creak. She heard the bowl being lifted. She didn't hear him say thank you, and she was grateful for that, because if he thanked her now, she would have to think about what she had just done. When she went outside at 6 o'clock to collect the bowl, she saw that Bruno had moved out of the shade and was lying on the steps, and he was no longer 4 paces away. He had his whole head and one shoulder resting across Wesley Rourke's feet, 150 pounds pressing down on those Italian leather shoes like a sandbag, and the man was sitting perfectly still. Delaney stood in the doorway and looked at the clock on the stove. She looked again at 20 minutes to 7. The dog was still there. The man still hadn't moved. 40 minutes, and he didn't pull his feet away, didn't push the dog aside, didn't pat his head, didn't do any of the things a man did when he wanted an animal to know who was in charge. He simply let it happen. Delaney had known Bruno for 4 years, and in all that time Bruno had never lain across anyone's feet, not even hers. The dog sensed something she couldn't, and the worst part was that the dog had never been wrong. That was exactly the problem. She had relied on his instincts to decide who was allowed through the gate and who wasn't, and now he had just made the decision for her. And she didn't agree with it at all, and she couldn't challenge it either. She stood in the screen doorway with the empty bowl in her hand, looking out across the lawn as darkness gathered, and she thought that tomorrow she would tell him he couldn't stay. And even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't. On Saturday morning, she went out to the steps at 7 o'clock with a sheet of graph paper she had torn from the grocery notebook, 5 lines written across it in ballpoint pen, and she handed it to him before he had the chance to say good morning. She said she wasn't taking his money, that she had already told him so, and that she wouldn't say it again. She said what he was getting wasn't a place to stay. It was a list. Wesley took the paper. He read it standing beneath the 7 o'clock sunlight, and Delaney spoke each line aloud as he read, because she wanted to hear herself say them. 1. He would sleep in the loft above the boathouse. Not inside the boathouse, but in the loft, where there was a folding bed, an oil lamp, a window overlooking the lake, and nothing else. 2. He wasn't allowed inside the main house. He wasn't to step onto the main porch, look through the main house windows, or put his hand on the main house doorknob. That house belonged to Mrs. Priscilla Wick, who was in Lisbon and didn't know he existed, and Delaney was paid to keep it exactly as Mrs. Wick had left it, and that was her job, and her job was the only thing she had. 3. He wasn't to ask her about her past. Not one question. In return, she wouldn't ask him about his sleeve, his name, the agreement, or anything else. She spoke this line more slowly than the first 3, and she looked directly at him while she said it, and Wesley understood that this was the line she had written first, and that the other 4 had been written around it. 4. He wasn't to feed Bruno beneath the table, feed him from his hand, or give him anything from his plate, not even once, because the dog weighed 150 pounds and would live longer if he didn't weigh 165, and because Delaney had spent 2 years teaching him to sit still while people ate, and she wasn't going to let a stranger ruin that in a week. 5. And she paused before the 5th line. If anyone came looking for him, anyone at all, a car, a telephone call, a person walking down the gravel road, then he had to tell her first, not afterward, not while it was happening, before. She said those were her steps, and she had the right to know who was coming toward them. Wesley Rourke read all 5 lines. Then he folded the paper in half and placed it in his breast pocket, the same pocket that had held the confirmation sheet, and he said, "Okay, 1 word. Not a single question. Not 1 line negotiated, not 1 line softened, not 1 word of I understand Rule 3, but..." And what made him stand motionless for the next 3 seconds wasn't the 5 rules. It was how quickly that word, okay, had left his mouth. 19 years. In 19 years, no one had ever handed Wesley Rourke a list. People gave him proposals. They gave him demands, pleas, warnings, and once, a very long time ago, an ultimatum. And the man who wrote that ultimatum lived another 11 months. But no one had ever written down in ballpoint pen on graph paper what he was and wasn't allowed to do, then handed it to him at 7 o'clock in the morning as though it were an electric bill. He realized he didn't feel insulted. He felt something he had no name for, something that rested very close to relief, and he didn't like that he had no name for it. She gave him the key to the loft, an old brass key tied to a piece of twine. She said the loft door locked from the inside, but this key opened it from the outside, and she said nothing more, and Wesley understood that she was waiting to see what he would do with it. At 10 o'clock that night, he came down the loft stairs, crossed the lawn, placed the key on the kitchen doorstep, and went back. She heard it touch the wood through the screen. The next morning, it was still lying there until she picked it up and handed it back to him. He returned it at 10 o'clock that night, and the next night, and the night after that. By the 2nd week, the 3rd plank from the steps had begun to creak, and Delaney mentioned it one morning not as a request, but simply as someone might remark on the weather, and by that afternoon Wesley Rourke was crouched beside it, with a small pry bar he had found in the boathouse, and a cedar board he had spent 40 minutes cutting on the table saw in the yard. He pulled out the old plank. That part was easy. He set the new one in place, and it didn't fit, and he pressed it down with the heel of his hand, and it still didn't fit. And he sat back on his heels staring at the gap, exactly as wide as the thickness of a coin, running the full length of the board. He had cut it 1/8 of an inch too short. Delaney stood in the screen doorway with a dish towel in her hand, and she saw everything. She didn't say anything. She didn't come outside. She didn't tell him that he should measure twice and cut once. She didn't tell him that cedar swelled in damp weather and needed room. And she didn't bring out a ruler and show him where he had gone wrong. She turned back into the kitchen and left him sitting there with his missing 1/8 of an inch. Wesley had spent 19 years living in a world where every mistake he made was corrected by someone else, before he even had the chance to know it existed. That was the entire value of being who he was. Someone walked ahead of him and cleared the road. Someone followed behind him and swept it clean, and he walked in the middle, believing the road had always been spotless. Now there was a coin-wide gap in the porch of a woman's house, and no one in the world was going to come and fix it. He removed the board. He went back to the table saw. He cut a second one, and it was a 1/16 of an inch too long, and he had to plane it down by hand for 30 minutes beneath the sun, while sweat ran along his spine beneath the shirt he had worn for 4 days straight. And when he set it in place for the third time, it fit. He nailed it down. The first nail bent, the second went in crooked, the third went straight. He sat on the steps looking at the new cedar plank, bright and golden among the old boards that had weathered to the color of ash. And he knew it would take 3 summers to fade until it matched them. And he felt something inside his chest that he couldn't remember feeling before. It wasn't pride. Pride was something he knew well. This was smaller and cleaner. This was the feeling of a man who had finished one thing properly with his own 2 hands, and no one had paid him for it, and no one benefited from it except the plank itself. That night, he placed the key on the doorstep at 10 o'clock, just as he did every night. That weekend she let him bathe Bruno, and he did almost everything wrong, and the dog shook himself exactly once, and Wesley Rourke was soaked from his hair to his waist, and he laughed. The laughter escaped him before he could stop it, loud and misshapen, a sound he didn't recognize as his own, and he cut himself off halfway through, as though someone had closed a hand around his throat. He stood there in the soap suds, still holding the brush, and tried to remember the last time he had made that sound, and he couldn't. 19 years was long enough to forget what your own laughter sounded like, and what frightened him wasn't that he had forgotten, but that he had lived through every one of those 19 years without once realizing that he had. Delaney heard it from the kitchen. She didn't turn around. She stood still with both hands in the sink and waited until it was quiet outside again, and then she finished washing the pot. By the 3rd week, he had learned the names of everything in the herb bed. She didn't teach him. She merely said their names as she passed once without repeating them. Rosemary, thyme, oregano, tarragon, which Mrs. Wick had planted 30 years earlier and no one used anymore, though Delaney still watered it. Parsley, 2 kinds, 1 flat leaf and 1 curly, and she said the flat leaf kind was for eating, while the curly kind was for decoration and no one should grow it. He remembered all of them. He didn't know why. He only knew that when he walked past the herb bed on his 22nd morning at Mirror Lake and automatically thought the word tarragon, something inside him had shifted by about 1/8 of an inch, and no one in the world was going to come and move it back. The storm passed over Mirror Lake on Tuesday evening, during the final week of June, and the power went out at 9:10, and Delaney was so accustomed to it that she didn't stop what she was doing. She simply reached to the top of the cabinet for the oil lamp Mrs. Wick had left there since before Delaney was born, lit it with a wooden match, and set it in the middle of the kitchen table. There was no moon. The rain had stopped, but the clouds remained, and beyond the screen doorway lay a darkness that was dense and complete. No streetlights, no neighboring houses, nothing within 1.5 miles except the yellow flame, as tall as a pinky finger, burning inside a glass globe on the wooden table. Wesley knocked on the doorframe, because he had seen the light change color from the loft and wanted to make certain it was an oil lamp and not something else. She told him the door wasn't locked. He came inside and sat in the chair across from her, and Bruno stretched out beneath the table between them, and for 40 minutes they said nothing that mattered. She dried a few glasses. He straightened the stack of old newspapers used to start the stove, and the lamplight made everything in the kitchen recede into shapes. Then she reached across the table to turn the wick down a little, and her left sleeve slipped back to her elbow. It was uncovered for only 2 seconds, but the lamp was right there, and her arm passed in front of it, and Wesley Rourke saw the inside of her wrist with perfect clarity. There were 7 scars. They were round, equal in diameter, evenly spaced along a slight curve that followed the tendon of her wrist, and they were old, milky white, raised above the skin. Wesley had spent 19 years in a world where people left marks on one another's bodies. And he didn't need even a second to know what they were, and he didn't need a second to know they weren't accidents, because accidents didn't happen 7 times at evenly measured intervals. He didn't ask. He didn't look away. because looking away was a kind of lie, and he didn't stare either. He simply allowed those 2 seconds to pass with his eyes exactly where they already were. And then he lowered his right hand to the tabletop and used his thumb to turn the black steel ring on his left pinky exactly once, slowly, almost invisibly, a movement he had made thousands of times in rooms where someone was about to lose something. Delaney saw him do it. She pulled her sleeve down, not quickly, not with a jerk. She simply drew it over her wrist with the same gesture she had made 10,000 times in 4 years, a gesture that had become part of the way she stood. And then she placed both hands in her lap beneath the table, sat with her back straight, and looked at the lamp. 4 minutes passed, neither of them spoke. Bruno breathed beneath the table, slow and heavy. Rain dripped from the edge of the porch roof onto the new cedar plank, the one that was still pale, each drop making a single sound. The flame inside the glass globe leaned slightly when a draft slipped through the crack beside the door, then straightened again. Delaney had been waiting for this moment since the first week. She had known it would come because it always did, and she had rehearsed her answer for every version of it, for the version that asked who did that to you, for the version that said, "Oh my God, Delaney," for the version with a hand reaching across the table that she would have to avoid. She had an answer ready for every one of those versions. What she didn't have was an answer for 4 minutes of silence. Then Wesley Rourke spoke. He spoke very softly, and he looked at the lamp instead of at her, and his voice was no louder than the rain dripping onto the plank. He said he wouldn't ask. Then he said that if she ever spoke a name, he would know what to do with it. He didn't say another word. He didn't explain what he meant, because both people in that kitchen knew exactly what he meant, and saying it plainly would have turned it into a threat instead of a fact. Delaney sat very still. She felt something rise in her throat, and she didn't allow it to go any farther. In 4 years, no one had ever given her anything like this. People had given her advice. They had given her hotline numbers, pink pamphlets, embraces she hadn't asked for, questions about why she hadn't left sooner. No one had ever given her an action. No one had ever told her that the name was something that could be carried somewhere, and used to do something. She looked at the man sitting across from her on the other side of the oil lamp, and she understood, with complete clarity and not the slightest trace of uncertainty, exactly what kind of man he was, and that he had just told her so in the kindest way a man like him could. She said it was the most terrifyingly kind thing anyone had ever said to her. Wesley didn't answer. He turned the ring back to its original position, and he sat there with her until the oil in the lamp had burned down by half. On the last Sunday in July, Delaney returned from Keene Valley at 6 o'clock in Mrs. Wick's pickup truck, and she didn't go into the kitchen. She walked straight to the steps where Wesley was sitting, shelling peas into a bowl, and stood there until he looked up. She said that one of the 3 houses she cleaned on weekends belonged to a man who was a federal judge for the Northern District of New York, that he lived in Keene Valley from May through October, that he had a desk in the reading room, and that he never locked it because, in his mind, the person who ran the vacuum cleaner wasn't someone who knew how to read. She said she had been cleaning that house for 3 years. She said that on June 18th, which was the 2nd week after he arrived, she had been wiping down that desk when she saw an open file, and inside that file was a surveillance photograph, taken from a distance through a car window, grainy and black and white, and she had looked at it for exactly 4 seconds before continuing to clean. She said the name written on the file. She said it calmly, as though reading an item from a grocery list. Wesley Rourke set the bowl down on the step. He didn't stand. He didn't look toward the gravel road. He didn't look toward his car. And the first thing that passed through his mind wasn't a question but a calculation. Automatic cold, embedded in his spine after 19 years. Who else had seen it? Whom had she told? How many days had passed? And he let the calculation run through one complete cycle before allowing it to fall away, and he sat still. Delaney said she had known for 7 weeks. She said that during those 7 weeks she had cooked soup for him. She said she had given him a key to the loft, and he had returned it for 47 nights in a row, and she had counted. She said she had stood in the kitchen and heard him laugh while bathing the dog, and she hadn't turned around. She said all of it in a voice that was perfectly flat, without trembling, without rising. And Wesley realized that she wasn't afraid of him, and that she wasn't angry either, and that what he was hearing in her voice was something else entirely. something he had heard only in people who had lived on alert for so long that their vigilance had burned through all its own fuel. She was tired, that was all. Then she said the final sentence. She said, "Now tell me why you didn't kill me when you knew I knew." The words fell onto the steps and lay there between them. Bruno raised his head from his front paws and looked from one person to the other. The lake behind her was turning the color of pewter. Wesley Rourke sat on the steps of a woman who weighed half as much as he did, and he understood that she had calculated this even more carefully than he had, that she had chosen Sunday, because Sunday was the only day of the week. Mrs. Wick's pickup was in the yard, that she had chosen 6 o'clock because there was still daylight, that she had chosen the steps because Bruno was there, and that she had waited 7 weeks not because she was afraid, but because she needed enough evidence. She had watched him the way people watched the weather. 47 nights with the key on the doorstep. 1/8 of an inch in the cedar plank, 4 minutes of silence beneath the oil lamp. She had gathered each thing one by one and added them together, and now she stood before him with the total in her hands, asking him to confirm it. He didn't give her an explanation. He didn't tell her she had misunderstood him. Didn't say there were things more complicated than she realized. Didn't say he had never laid a hand on a woman, though that was true. Because he knew that throwing out that truth now would be a defense of himself, and she would smell it immediately. He said 7 words. He said, "Because you kept making soup for me." Delaney stood there for a long time. Then she nodded once, the brief nod of someone who had just received the exact number she had been waiting for, and she said all right. And she went into the kitchen and turned on the stove and cooked dinner. Wesley remained on the steps with the bowl of half-shelled peas, and he didn't pick it up for 15 minutes. For 19 years he had lived by a single rule, that anyone who knew was a problem. And problems had ways of being handled, and he had applied that rule without a single exception. And now there was a woman in the kitchen 4 yards away, who knew exactly who he was and was chopping onions. And he understood that the rule had just died on those steps at 11 minutes past 6 on a Sunday evening, and that it hadn't died because he had decided to kill it. It had died because she had made the soup first. By August, she stopped locking the loft door. It happened without any announcement. One evening, Wesley climbed the stairs and found that the inside bolt had been pulled from its socket and hung on the nail beside the doorframe, and no one said anything to him about it, and he understood that it wasn't an invitation but a declaration, that this door no longer needed to be locked because the person inside it had been placed in a different category. He still returned the key. At 10 o'clock that night, he went downstairs, crossed the lawn, placed the brass key, tied twine on the kitchen doorstep, and went back. She heard it touch the wood. The next morning it was still lying there, and she picked it up and handed it back to him with his coffee, and neither of them said a word about the bolt having been removed, and neither of them said a word about the key still making its way down to the doorstep every night. And that was how it continued through the first 2 weeks of August. On the night of August 9th, there was no wind. Wesley went out to the dock after dinner as he always did, sat at the far end with his legs hanging over the water, and the lake was so still that it was no longer water, but some kind of sheet of black metal printed with the reflections of upside-down trees. He sat there for 40 minutes. Then he heard the dock boards creak behind him. 11 sounds spaced evenly apart, and he didn't turn around. Delaney walked to the end of the dock and sat down on his left. She said nothing. She let her legs hang over the water too, and she sat close enough for her left shoulder to touch his right, not much. Only a single point of contact the width of a hand through 2 thin layers of cotton. Bruno came out behind her and lay down halfway along the dock, released the long, heavy sigh of a large dog, and fell asleep. Neither of them moved. Wesley Rourke had spent 19 years treating every distance between himself and another body as tactical information. He knew exactly how far away a person needed to stand, so they couldn't reach his waist. He knew the scent of someone who was about to lie. He had sat in cars with men whose shoulders pressed against his for 4 hours, and he had counted every breath they took. The point of contact on his right shoulder was the width of a hand, and he didn't know what to do with it, because it wasn't information and there was nothing to calculate. He could only sit still and allow it to remain there. A great blue heron landed in the shallows about 30 yards from the dock, without making a sound, and it stood on one leg and didn't move again. Delaney watched it, Wesley watched it. The lake rose once and then settled, a movement so slow and slight that it traveled all the way from the opposite shore. The rhythm people who lived beside the water called the lake breathing, and that rhythm passed beneath their 4 feet and continued toward the rocky bank. Then another breath came. 10 minutes. The heron still hadn't moved. 20 minutes. Somewhere to the left, a fish broke the surface once, then everything went quiet again. Bruno rolled over in his sleep, and his tail struck the dock boards twice before becoming still. 30 minutes. Stars appeared above the pine ridge on the western shore, one at a time, not all together. 40 minutes. Delaney thought about how she had sat alone on this dock for nearly 1,500 evenings and had never once considered that it might be able to hold 2 people. Wesley thought about how he owned 11 houses and couldn't remember which direction the bedroom windows faced in any one of them. 50 minutes. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them shifted. Neither of them reached across that distance of nothing to do anything with it, because they both knew, without discussing it, that if either of them moved even 4/10 of an inch, what existed there would end, and something else would begin. Something more ordinary, something they both already knew how to handle. Neither of them knew how to handle this. That was why they left it untouched. 1 hour. The great blue heron lowered its other foot, took 3 steps, and lifted into the air, and the sound of its wings was like someone shaking out a bedsheet in an empty room. Delaney stood. She said goodnight, and she went inside. Wesley remained alone on the dock, and he felt the place on his right shoulder grow cold very slowly in the August air. And at 10 o'clock that night, he walked to the kitchen doorstep and placed the key there as he did every evening. On August 14th, Delaney left for Keene Valley at 8 o'clock in the morning, and Wesley remained alone with the dog. And that was why Otto Brandt chose that particular day, because Otto Brandt had been sitting in a rental car at the final bend of the gravel road since Monday, counting. He came in on foot. He left the car a quarter of a mile away and walked, and Wesley heard the sound of shoes on gravel from nearly 60 yards out, and he knew who it was before he saw him, because Otto Brandt walked on his heels. He had always walked on his heels. He had walked that way for 11 years, and Wesley had heard that rhythm in every kind of hallway. Bruno stood. He didn't bark. He moved 4 paces in front of the steps and stood there, the fur along his neck rising into a ridge down his back, and Wesley said the dog's name once, softly, and Bruno sat but didn't look away. Otto Brandt was 44 years old and wore a light jacket in August because he always wore a jacket, and he stopped at the edge of the lawn, beyond the dog's reach, with such precision that Wesley knew he had measured the distance with his eyes from 10 yards away. He wasn't carrying a gun. Wesley saw that immediately, saw it in the way the jacket hung, and in the way both hands rested loosely at his sides, and that was what sent a chill along his spine, not the opposite. Otto reached inside his jacket and withdrew a pale yellow envelope, oversized, folded once lengthwise and then pressed flat again. He didn't open it. He held it between 2 fingers and looked at the boathouse, looked at the dock, looked at the cedar plank that was still bright against the weathered porch, and then he spoke a name. He said Delaney Halliwell. Wesley didn't move. He sat on the steps with both hands resting on his knees, and he let the name pass through him. And he didn't allow a single muscle in his face to respond, while something inside his chest had just fallen through several floors and was still falling. Otto said he wasn't asking. He said he had spent 6 days finding Wesley, and that he had found him not through cameras, not through a name, not through a credit card, but by calling 17 rental agencies in the Adirondacks and asking whether anyone had booked the wrong property during the first week of June, and the 11th person had said yes. He said that if he could do it in 6 days, then the council could do it too, and the council had already had 70 days. Then Otto Brandt said the sentence Wesley would carry with him for the rest of the summer. He said that for the past 2 months, Wesley had been sleeping in the boathouse loft of the woman his enemy had left behind. He said the council believed Wesley had arranged this. He said Fitz also believed Wesley had arranged it. He said he was the only one who believed Wesley had simply been stupid, boss. And then he said he wasn't sure he still believed that anymore. Wesley asked what was inside the envelope. Otto said he didn't know, that he hadn't opened it, that the person who gave it to him had said that if he opened it, he would become part of it, and Otto Brandt had survived to 44 by never becoming part of anything. He bent down and placed the envelope on the lawn, on the ground, without handing it directly to Wesley. And then he stepped back twice. He said there were 6 days. Wesley asked 6 days for what? Otto said, "Read it and find out," and he turned away and walked back toward the gravel road on his heels. And the sound of his shoes grew smaller until there was nothing left but the water lapping beneath the dock. The envelope remained on the lawn for 3 hours. Wesley didn't pick it up. Bruno went over and smelled it once, then walked away. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Wesley picked it up, carried it to the loft, placed it face down on the folding bed, and went back outside, and he split wood beneath the sun for 2 hours until the skin on both his hands tore open. Delaney returned at 6 o'clock. She was carrying a bag of tomatoes the judge had given her. She asked whether anything had happened that day, and Wesley Rourke stood in the kitchen 5 feet away from her, his hands still sticky with tree sap, looking directly into the face of the woman who had written in ballpoint pen on graph paper that if anyone came looking for him, he had to tell her first, and he said nothing had happened. That was rule number 5. It had survived for 70 days. It died at 6:04 on the evening of August 14th, in a kitchen, beside a bag of tomatoes, and the woman who had created it didn't even know it was dead. At 11 o'clock that night, he opened it. The oil lamp stood on the wooden crate beside the folding bed. The window was open to the lake, and inside the envelope were 19 sheets of paper. No letter, no message, nothing but copies. The first page was a redacted affidavit, black bars running across it like bricks, but the heading hadn't been redacted, and in that heading was a name, Trent Halliwell, 39 years old, born in Buffalo. The second page was a memorandum from the United States Marshal's Service, dated April 5 years earlier, confirming the transfer and relocation of a cooperating witness, and below it were 3 redacted lines, and beneath those was 1 line left visible, stating that the spouse had been informed of the right to enter the program and had declined to participate. Wesley read that line 3 times. He knew the law. The program didn't force anyone to go with the witness. A husband or wife was asked, and if they said no, the record stated that they had said no, and the door closed, and the person leaving left while the person staying remained behind, with the name the other one had abandoned. The 4th page was a list of cases in which Halliwell's testimony had been used. There were 11 entries. The 9th was a case in Buffalo, closed, with 4 people convicted. The 11th was dated November of the previous year. It was a list of names presented to a federal grand jury in Albany, and Wesley Rourke's name was on that list. And beside his name were a date and a time, and the source of that name was a man living under another name in another state, under the protection of the United States Marshal's Service. And that man was Trent Halliwell. Wesley sat perfectly still on the folding bed. He had spent 9 months searching for the person who had sold him out. He had built a list of 30 names in his mind and crossed them off one by one, and the correct name had never been on that list because it belonged to a man Wesley Rourke had never met even once in his life. A man who had traded him away not out of hatred, not for money, but simply because Wesley's name happened to be inside his head, and he needed something to exchange for a new life. The 14th page was an inventory of property. In the middle of the list, between a Ford and a refrigerator, was an entry for 1 male black Neapolitan Mastiff, registered in 2020, and the registered owner's name was Trent Halliwell. Wesley set the paper down. He looked out the window. Below, on the dark lawn, the 6-year-old dog lay where he always lay, facing the gravel road. He had been brought home at 1 year old. He had been left behind at 18 months. During those 6 months, he had learned one thing, exactly one thing, and he had carried it with him through the next 4.5 years, after the man who taught him had vanished. And that thing was to move 4 paces forward and place himself between the woman and whoever was coming. Wesley sat in the lamplight and understood that the dog hadn't been trained. No one trained a dog to do that. A dog learned it by seeing that it needed to be done, over and over, inside a house, while it was still very young. He raised one hand and touched the left sleeve of the shirt hanging from the nail, the shirt he had worn on June 6th and had never thrown away. The dark stain was still there, dried stiff near the wrist. It was his own blood. On the night of June 5th, in the room in Albany, when the agreement had been read aloud, and he understood that its only truly valuable condition was his sister, Wesley Rourke had stood, walked into the hallway, and driven his fist into a mirror, and the broken glass had cut a line 1.5 inches long along the inside of his left wrist, and he had wrapped it in a handkerchief, driven through the night, and arrived at Mirror Lake at 10:40 the next morning, with the wound still seeping through the fabric. It wasn't anyone else's blood. That was the only thing Delaney Pike had guessed wrong during the entire summer. He blew out the lamp. He lay down in the darkness and listened to the water striking beneath the boathouse floor, and he rearranged everything into a new order. The woman below had made soup for him on 47 evenings. The dog had lain across his feet for 40 minutes, 7 round scars on one wrist. And all of those things came from the same man, a man he had never met, a man sleeping somewhere that night under some name, alive, protected, and completely unaware that both of the ones he had left behind were breathing beside the same lake. The next morning, he placed the 19 sheets of paper on the kitchen table in front of her, and said nothing. Delaney wiped her hands on a towel. She sat down. She read the first page without reacting, then read the second and stopped at the unredacted line, the one stating that the spouse had been informed of the right to participate and had declined, and she looked at it longer than she looked at the others. Then she continued turning the pages. She read all 19 sheets in 14 minutes, without asking a single question, and when she gathered them into a stack and tapped the edges against the tabletop to straighten them, Wesley understood that she had known all of this for a long time. All of it except one thing, and that thing was on the 11th page. She said she hadn't known Trent had given them his name. She said that was the only part of the stack that was new to her. Then she told him. She spoke in the voice of someone reading an instruction manual. She said that in April of that year, 2 men had come to the house and sat in the kitchen for 40 minutes, and when they left, Trent told her he was going away, and she said all right, and then he said one sentence, and she repeated it word for word, because she had been repeating it inside her head for 5 years. He asked her whether she intended to become a problem. She said he hadn't asked whether she wanted to go with him. She said the man from the United States Marshals Service had asked, because that was his job, and he had followed the proper procedure, read her rights from a sheet of paper, and she had said no, and he had written down that she had said no, but Trent hadn't asked. He had asked whether she intended to become a problem. She said those were 2 different questions, Mr. Rourke, and she had had 5 years to learn just how different they were. Then she told him the rest. She said that the previous September, Trent's mother had spent 9 weeks in a hospital in Buffalo, and she had no insurance. And the hospital needed some sort of guarantor, and Trent was out of state, and Delaney was 23 years old, and she signed. She said $47,000 the way someone might recite a zip code. She said the woman died in February, and Trent disappeared in April. But the signature didn't disappear, because in the state of New York, a guarantor wasn't a relative. A guarantor was a contracting party, and a contracting party didn't die with the patient. She said she couldn't file for bankruptcy. She said it, and Wesley waited for her to explain, and she explained in exactly 3 sentences. Her identity record was part of an open federal case in which her husband was a witness, and when a record belonged to an active case, it was frozen, not to punish her, only to keep anyone from using it to trace him. No one had explained that to her. She had discovered it only when she was 24, after the bank closed her account without warning, and then she applied for a job at the hospital in Saranac, and they called back to say their verification system returned no result for her name, and then she tried to rent an apartment, and they ran her credit, and the screen displayed an error code, even the leasing agent had never seen before. She said that over 4 years, she had called 11 telephone numbers, and each one transferred her to another, and the final number was always a full voicemail box. She said she had a driver's license that still remained because it had been issued before everything happened. And she said that license was the only proof she had left that she existed. Then she fell silent. She didn't cry. She sat with her back straight and both hands resting on the stack of papers, looking through the window toward the dock, and that flat voice was the worst thing Wesley had heard in 19 years. Worse than screaming, because a scream was something that still believed someone was listening. He sat there and didn't apologize. He didn't say a word, because any words he spoke now would be meant to make him feel better, not her. He simply sat and allowed something to enter him that he had avoided for 19 years. The man who had pressed cigarettes into her wrist was one very small link in a very long chain, and at the other end of that chain were rooms like the room in Albany, tables like the one where he had sat, agreements like the agreement he had signed. He had never touched a woman. He had never needed to touch one. He had only needed to build and maintain a world in which men like Trent Halliwell could exist, a world where they had somewhere to sell other people's names, where they were rewarded with a new life while the person left behind was rewarded with an error code on a screen. He hadn't held the cigarette. He had built the house in which that cigarette was lit. There was one thing Wesley didn't tell Delaney, and that was that he had read those 19 sheets twice, and the second time he hadn't read the contents. He had read the envelope. The envelope had no stamp, no postmark. It had been folded once lengthwise and then pressed flat again, and there was only one person in the world who folded paper that way, lengthwise before slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket, because he had done it since the days when he carried documents for Wesley's father in the 1980s, and he had never broken the habit. Wesley sat in the loft and stared at that crease for a long time. Fitz Duhamel was 61 years old. He had been with the Rourke family for 40 years. He was the man who taught Wesley how to tie his shoes. He was the man who sat in the second row at Wesley's mother's funeral, and was the only person who didn't offer a single word of comfort, who simply handed the 8-year-old boy a handkerchief and sat silently beside him for 2 hours. And Wesley had remembered that for 30 years. On August 16th, Wesley walked 2 miles to the last surviving payphone outside the gas station at the junction of Route 43. And he called a number he had known by heart since he was 12, and Fitz answered on the second ring, just as he had always answered on the second ring. Wesley didn't ask. He only said the envelope had been folded lengthwise. The other end of the line was silent for 5 seconds. Then Fitz Duhamel said yes, one word, and in that one word Wesley heard all 40 years. Fitz said he had given the Halliwell file to Otto and told Otto to bring it up. Fitz said he was also the one who had told the council about Mirror Lake on August 9th, 5 days before Otto found it. Fitz said he hadn't taken a single dollar. Wesley asked why. He asked in the voice of an 8-year-old boy, and he hated himself for it, and he couldn't stop. Fitz released a long breath through the line, the breath of an old man who had already been sitting with this answer for weeks. He said he had loved Wesley's father. He said he had loved Wesley since the boy was 8 years old. He said that was precisely why he had done it. Then he said the rest slowly, without raising his voice, as though reading a diagnosis. He said he had been standing in the hallway in Albany on the night of June 5th. He had seen Wesley punch the mirror. But the mirror wasn't what had chilled him. What had chilled him was what happened 30 seconds earlier, when the agreement had been read aloud and Wesley Rourke had asked whether he could have more time to think. Fitz said he heard those words leave Wesley's mouth, and knew at once. He said Wesley's father had never asked anyone for anything in 40 years, and that was why Wesley's father had died in his own bed. He said Wesley had begun asking permission. He said men like us aren't allowed to ask. He said once people heard him ask once, they would wait for him to ask a second time, and they would never stop waiting, and on the day he stopped asking they wouldn't believe him, and they would test him. And they had test him when he could least endure being tested. Fitz said he had seen it happen 3 times in 40 years, and all 3 times it had taken between 18 months and 2 years, and all 3 times it had ended the same way, slowly, messily, and in front of everyone. He said he couldn't bear to watch it happen to Wesley. He said he had sold Wesley to the council so it would happen now, quickly and cleanly, while he still had enough influence to make certain it would be quick and clean. He said it was the last kindness he had left to give. Wesley stood inside the phone booth outside the gas station at the junction of Route 43, with the receiver pressed to his ear, and he lowered his right hand and used his thumb to turn the black steel ring on his left pinky exactly once. He asked how much Otto knew. Fitz said Otto knew nothing. Fitz said he had handed Otto the envelope and told him that if he opened it, he would become part of it, and Otto Brandt was the kind of man who followed instructions. And Otto Brandt had walked a quarter of a mile so he wouldn't have to drive into a yard with a dog. And Otto Brandt had spent 6 days calling 17 rental agencies instead of telling the council what he suspected. Fitz said the final sentence very softly. He said Otto Brandt had never betrayed Wesley for a single day in 11 years, and that Wesley had hated him throughout those 11 years, and that this had been the greatest mistake of Wesley's life until that summer. Then Fitz hung up. Wesley remained inside the phone booth for a long time. with the receiver still in his hand and the steady dial tone entering his ear. And outside on Route 43 a logging truck passed and the ground trembled, and he thought about a handkerchief being handed to an 8-year-old boy in the second row. Otto had said 6 days, and he had said it on the 14th, so the deadline was the 20th. Wesley knew exactly what that deadline required without reading another page. The council didn't need him dead. The council needed to know who he still was. 70 days spent vanished beside a lake, with the woman the witness had left behind could be explained in only 2 ways. Either he had arranged it so he could reach Trent Halliwell through her, or he had gone soft. They could forgive the first. They couldn't forgive the second. So they gave him a test, and the test was that he return to Albany before the 20th and deal with Delaney Halliwell. And the word deal was left deliberately unfinished because in 40 years that word had never needed anything added to it. That was the first clock. The second clock began running on the 17th. Delaney saw it first. A gray sedan was parked at the bend on Cutter's Lane on Saturday morning, and it was still there that afternoon, and she passed it twice in Mrs. Wick's pickup truck. And the second time, the person sitting inside didn't look at her, and she came home and told Wesley there was a car that didn't belong to the village. Wesley knew at once who it was. Not the council. The council didn't park at a bend where the whole village drove past. It was the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they were there because Wesley Rourke had been the target of an open federal investigation in Albany since November of the previous year, and it had taken them 73 days to find him, and now they were simply sitting there, waiting for him to do something. Wesley had to explain to Delaney that the people in the gray sedan had nothing to do with the people who had taken Trent away. The United States Marshal Service handled hiding witnesses. The Federal Bureau of Investigation handled arresting defendants. 2 agencies, 2 buildings, 2 budgets, and they didn't speak to each other any more than they were required to. The man in the car hadn't come because of her. He had come because he wanted to see Wesley Rourke touch something. The third clock had been running since June, and no one had noticed. On the 18th, Delaney checked the mail at Verna's store and found a postcard from Lisbon. Mrs. Priscilla Wick had written in blue ink that she would return on September 1st, that she had sold the house, that the buyer would take possession on the 5th, that she was sorry for the late notice, and that she had enclosed a check for 2 months of wages. Delaney read it standing in the middle of the store beside the bread rack. She read it again. Then she put it in her pocket, bought milk, and went home. She didn't tell Wesley until that evening. She told him in that same flat voice. She said September 1st. She said the job would end, and the boathouse was housing that came with the job, so the housing would end too. Wesley asked where she would go. She said there was a boarding house in Saranac for $480 a month, and she had asked about it in May when she first sensed this was coming. Then she fell silent. Wesley waited. She said they didn't allow dogs. That was the entire sentence. She said nothing more. She stood at the sink with her back to him and washed 2 bowls, hers and his, and Bruno lay beneath the table breathing slowly and heavily. 6 years old, 150 pounds, and both people in that kitchen knew exactly what the sentence meant, and neither of them said it aloud. Wesley Rourke sat in the chair and looked at 3 numbers. August 20th, the gray sedan at the bend. September 1st. Those 3 deadlines had nothing to do with one another. No one had arranged them. The council didn't know Mrs. Wick existed. The Federal Bureau of Investigation didn't know the boarding house in Saranac existed. Mrs. Priscilla Wick, 71 years old, sat in Lisbon and wrote a courteous postcard without the slightest idea that it would fall into the very same week. That was what sent a chill down his spine. For 19 years, he had lived in a world where everything had been arranged by someone, where coincidence was a word for fools. He sat in that kitchen and understood that the 3 things tightening around that woman's throat in the same week were completely separate, and that this was how the real world worked. It didn't arrange anything. There were simply enough things falling at once. He had no plan. That was the truth, and he sat with it. For 19 years, he had always had a plan, always had 2, always had a third that no one knew about. And now he sat at a wooden table with both hands still calloused from splitting firewood and his mind completely empty. Delaney turned off the faucet. She said he should go to bed. She said tomorrow was Monday, and she had to leave for Keene Valley at 8 o'clock. She said it as though next week still existed. At 2 o'clock in the morning on August 19th, Wesley woke to a sound coming from the lawn below, not barking. Something else, dry and repetitive. An animal trying to vomit and unable to bring anything up. He went down the loft stairs barefoot and found Delaney already there, kneeling in the wet grass beneath the rain with a flashlight, while Bruno stood with all four legs spread apart, his belly swollen and hard as a drum, and he tried to vomit again, and nothing came out. Delaney said one word. She said torsion. She said it like someone reading the results of her own medical test. 4 years of living with a deep-chested dog meant 4 years of reading everything there was to read about this, and she knew she had about an hour, perhaps 2, and after that there would be nothing anyone could do. Mrs. Wick's pickup had been at a repair shop in Lake Placid since Thursday. Wesley couldn't drive the Escalade, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because a gray sedan was parked at the bend, and a black vehicle leaving Cutter's Lane at 2 o'clock in the morning would be recorded, and the name attached to that license plate would enter a report, and that report would go to Albany, and at the other end of Albany was a 33-year-old woman who would be made to pay for it. Wesley stood in the rain and made that calculation in the space of a single breath, then bent down, slid both arms beneath the dog's belly and hindquarters, and lifted him. 150 pounds. Bruno didn't struggle. Delaney said Warren Kessel's clinic was 1.4 miles away. She said he was retired. Wesley said go. They walked through the rain along Cutter's Lane, and then turned left onto the village road. Delaney leading with the flashlight, Wesley following with 150 pounds in his arms. And he didn't set the dog down even once. The first quarter mile was manageable. By half a mile, his arms had begun to tremble from Olsel down. At 1 mile, he could no longer feel his hands, and he began counting his steps, 20 steps and then 20 more, while rain ran into his eyes and he couldn't wipe it away. Neither of them spoke. The dog breathed against his neck, short and shallow, growing shallower with every moment. Warren Kessel, 52 years old, opened the door in his pajamas at 2:40. He looked at the dog's swollen belly for 3 seconds and didn't ask a single question. He simply pulled the door wide, switched on the lights in the operating room, and told Wesley to place him on the table, and as he walked, he said he had spent 14 years performing emergency veterinary surgery in Syracuse before moving up here, and that he had kept this table because he had never been able to let it go. The door closed. Delaney and Wesley sat in the waiting room, both of them soaked through on 2 plastic chairs beneath fluorescent lights, while the smell of antiseptic was so thick it settled at the base of the tongue. At 3:10, Kessel came out once and said the stomach had twisted 180 degrees, that he had untwisted it, and that he was stitching it to the abdominal wall so it couldn't twist again, and then he paused and said the sentence he was required to say. He said the cost would be $4,000. He asked whether she had it. Delaney opened her mouth. Wesley spoke before she could. He said, I have everything, then he said the rest, and he said it to the floor rather than to anyone in the room. He said, that's exactly the problem, he said. I've never once had it at the moment when it mattered. Kessel looked at him for 1 second, then nodded and went back inside. At 4:25 the door opened, and Warren Kessel said Bruno had made it. He said the dog would sleep until noon, that he would need to eat 4 small meals every day for the rest of his life, and that he would live. Delaney nodded. She said, thank you. She sat down in the plastic chair, and then she folded forward, covered her face with both hands, and cried. It wasn't graceful crying. It came out of her like something that had been trapped for 4 years, ugly and loud and beyond control, and her shoulders convulsed, and she couldn't stop for nearly 2 minutes. Wesley didn't touch her. He sat beside her and waited. When she raised her head, her face was red and swollen, and she spoke the truth, saying it in a broken voice she didn't have time to repair. She said, it isn't because of the dog, she said, for 4 years. I haven't been allowed to ask anyone for anything, she said. I'd forgotten that asking was possible. At 4:40, beneath the fluorescent lights and within the smell of antiseptic, both of them wet from their hair to their shoes, she stood to leave, and he stood at the same moment, and neither of them had planned what happened next. He kissed her, or she kissed him. Neither of them remembered afterward, and neither of them asked. It was awkward. Her nose struck his cheekbone. Her hair was wet and cold and clung to his hand. Her mouth tasted of salt from her tears, and he hadn't shaved in 17 hours. It lasted about 4 seconds, and it wasn't beautiful at all. And that was exactly why, for a very long time afterward, they both remembered it precisely, second by second. On the morning of August 20th, Delaney went to pick Bruno up from Warren Kessel's clinic in the doctor's own car, and when she returned to the boathouse at 11 o'clock, the loft was empty. The folding bed had been folded away. The oil lamp had been cleaned and set neatly on the wooden crate. The shirt with the dark stain on its left sleeve was no longer hanging from the nail. The Escalade was still parked in the same place on the gravel, and that was what made her stop in the middle of the yard, because if the vehicle was still there, then he had left on foot, and a man who walked away from a place was a man who didn't intend to return by the same road. She didn't call his name. She went into the kitchen. She looked at the doorstep. There was nothing there. For 4 years, Delaney Pike had learned that a doorstep was where people left the things they didn't have the courage to place directly into someone's hand, and she had found all kinds of things on doorsteps, a piece of paper, a key, once even a wedding ring, and she had learned that when something appeared on a doorstep, it meant the person had already gone. But the doorstep was empty. That afternoon, she walked to Verna Cobb's store to buy soft food for the dog, who had just undergone surgery, and Verna Cobb, 68 years old, stood behind the counter and said nothing until Delaney placed her things on the glass. Then she opened the drawer beneath the cash register, took out the brass key, tied with a piece of twine, and set it down between them. She said he had come there at 7 o'clock that morning. She said he had stood exactly where Delaney was standing and asked her to pass this along. Then Verna repeated his words without correcting them or adding anything, in the voice of someone reading a sentence handed down by a judge. She said he asked me to tell you that he didn't want you to find it on the doorstep. She said he told me that finding things on a doorstep is how people learn that someone else has left. Then Verna Cobb looked up and stared directly into Delaney's face, and she said the sentence Delaney would still remember in October. She said, "I've known you since you were 22 years old, Delaney Pike." She said that's the first time a man has ever thought about the doorstep. Delaney picked up the key. She put it in her coat pocket. She paid for the dog food and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Verna," and she walked home, 1.5 miles beneath the sun, and she didn't cry and she didn't look back. She didn't ask Verna where he had gone. Verna didn't tell her. August 20th was the deadline. Wesley Rourke knew exactly when it expired, not at midnight, but when the council met, and the council always met at 4 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, and at 4 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, August 20th, Wesley Rourke was sitting in a plastic chair at the Trailways bus station in Lake Placid, and he wasn't going to Albany. He sat there and watched the hand of the clock pass the number 4. It wasn't forgetfulness. He had counted every minute. He knew that when the hand crossed that mark, 5 men in a room 210 miles away would look at one another and understand that Wesley Rourke hadn't come, and that his failure to appear was the answer, and that it was the only answer he could give without crossing a woman's doorstep. The first day, the second day, and the third day passed, and nothing happened, and that was the difficult part, because Wesley knew the council's silence didn't mean forgiveness. It meant they were meeting again. From the 4th day through the 6th, he stayed in a room rented by the week for cash in Glens Falls, and he signed nothing, and he called no one. On the 7th day, he went to Albany. He traveled by bus. Wesley Rourke, 37 years old, a man who hadn't used public transportation even once since he was 17, sat in the 8th row of a coach with a canvas bag and stared through the window for 3 hours, and not one person on that bus knew who he was, and that was the first thing all summer that he found useful. On the 7th day, the 8th day, and the 9th day, he was in Albany. Delaney knew nothing about those 3 days. She knew nothing about the 6 days before them. She fed the dog 4 small meals every day. She went to Keene Valley on Monday. She cleaned 2 more houses. She cleaned the empty loft. She kept the brass key in her coat pocket, and it was still there at the end of the 9th day. And that evening she sat alone at the kitchen table, while outside on the lawn the 6-year-old dog lay facing the gravel road, just as he had for 4.5 years, and no one came. On the afternoon of August 27th, Delaney returned from Keene Valley at 5 o'clock, and he was already sitting on the steps, on the very lowest one, and Bruno lay beside him, not 4 paces away, but pressed against his feet, the way he had lain there since that Friday evening in June. She stopped at the edge of the lawn, with the truck keys in her hand. He didn't stand. He said he had done 3 things, and he had done all 3 before coming back up here, and that this was the most important part of everything he was about to say, that all 3 were finished, signed, filed, impossible to reverse, and that she had no power to change them and no obligation to thank him for them. The first was that he no longer had anything. For the first time all summer, he said his sister's name, Corinne Rourke, 33 years old, an attorney in Albany. On the 26th, every legal asset in Wesley Rourke's name, 3 buildings, a harbor, a family fund, had been transferred into an irrevocable trust, whose beneficiary was Corinne, whose documents had been signed by Corinne, and the word irrevocable meant that not even Wesley could take it back. He said he hadn't done it to hide assets. He had done it for 2 reasons. The first was that the council now had nothing left to take from him. The second, and he said this more slowly, was that he now had nothing left to use to threaten anyone. He said that for 19 years, every conversation he entered had already been decided before he opened his mouth, not because of anything he said, but because of what he could do to the person sitting across from him, and he didn't want this conversation to be like that. He said he had kept exactly one thing. He raised his left hand. The black steel ring on his pinky. He said it was worth nothing, and that was precisely why. The second thing was $47,000. Delaney stood very still when he said the amount. He said he hadn't paid it. She said nothing. He continued. He said he had sat in Corinne's office on the 7th day and told his sister to transfer the money, and Corinne had looked at him and asked a question he couldn't answer. She had asked, and after that, what will she be to you? He said he had sat with that question for 2 days. He said that if he paid the $47,000, then for the rest of their lives, every time Delaney Pike stood in a room with him, there would be a number resting on the table between them, and that number would never grow smaller, and she would never be certain whether she stayed because she wanted to or because she owed him. He said, "I didn't pay it." Then he said the next thing while looking down at the lawn. He said, "I couldn't live with having paid it." What Corinne Rourke had done was much more difficult and had taken much longer. On the 8th day, she filed a dispute in Erie County Court challenging the debt, arguing that the guarantor's signature had been obtained under coercive circumstances, that the hospital had placed a guarantor form in front of a 22-year-old woman in an intensive care hallway while her mother-in-law was on a ventilator, without an attorney, without time to read it, and without any written alternative being offered. On the 9th day, she filed a second petition, this one in federal court, seeking to have Delaney Halliwell's identity record released from the open case, arguing that the record had been frozen to protect a witness who had been relocated 5 years earlier, that a spouse who hadn't entered the program wasn't a risk to that witness, and that keeping her unable to open a bank account, unable to be verified when applying for work, and unable to rent a home imposed a burden grossly disproportionate to any possible benefit. Wesley said it might take 4 months, it might take a year, it might fail. He said she would have to sit in a room in Albany for 6 hours and answer questions she would hate. Questions about that April night, about the kitchen, about the 2 men, about why she hadn't gone, and that someone would record it, and no one in that room would be kind to her. He said, "Then it's yours," he said, "not mine, yours." Delaney stood at the edge of the lawn and said nothing for a long time, and Wesley didn't fill the silence. Then she walked up the steps, past him, entered the kitchen, and set the keys on the table, and she stood with her back to him for a while, and when she turned around, her eyes were dry. For the third thing, he took a white envelope from his coat pocket and placed it on the kitchen table. He didn't open it. He didn't read it. He said it contained the answer to the question she had never asked, the question about his father, about the ring, and about why a 37-year-old man would allow other people to arrange 90 days of his life instead of standing up and fighting. He said she could read it that night. She could read it the next morning. She could put it in the stove. Then he stood to go outside. Delaney said his name. He stopped. She looked at the envelope on the wooden table and said she wouldn't read it that night. She said she would read it the next morning, in this kitchen, with him standing where she could see him, after he made the eggs. On the morning of August 28th, he came down the loft stairs at 7 o'clock, barefoot, his hair still wet from the lake, and when he reached the doorway, Bruno rose from inside and pushed the screen door open for him with his muzzle, something he hadn't done for anyone but Delaney in 4.5 years. On the kitchen table, the letter had already been opened. Delaney sat in the chair with both hands resting on the tabletop on either side of the page, and she didn't look up. Wesley went to the sink. He removed the black steel ring from the pinky of his left hand and placed it on the wood beside the sink. And for the first time in 19 years, that hand was bare, and he washed his hands and he cracked 4 eggs. She had already read it. She had read that his mother had 7 marks on the inside of her left wrist, round and evenly spaced, and that the person who had put them there was his father, and that the 8-year-old boy standing in the kitchen doorway of his home in Albany had watched it happen and had done nothing because he was 8 years old. She had read that the steel ring had belonged to his father, that it had been given to Wesley at the funeral, and that Wesley had worn it for 19 years not to remember the man, but so that every time his thumb touched it, he would remember exactly who he could become if he let go even once. She folded the paper into thirds. She placed it back inside the envelope. Wesley set a plate of eggs in front of her and stood there, exactly where she could see him, and waited for the question. Delaney picked up her fork. She said, "I'm going to eat these eggs," she said. "Then I'm going to teach you how to change the oil in the pickup, because you don't know how, and that's embarrassing," she said. "If I have a question in October, I'll ask it in October," she said. "Eat your eggs." And Wesley Rourke, a man who had commanded 200 people for 19 years, sat down and ate his eggs. He paid the price in full. He lost the organization, lost everything, not in a battle, but by failing to appear on a Wednesday afternoon. He lost Fitz Duhamel, and he would never again have the man who had handed him a handkerchief in the second row, and he understood that Fitz had truly loved him, and that was precisely what meant the wound would never heal. He would spend the next 3 years sitting in rooms with recording devices and federal attorneys, answering every question one by one, and Corinne would sit beside him, and not one day of those 3 years would be easy. They offered him witness protection, a new name, a new state, a life where no one could find him. He refused in 4 seconds. He said that all his life he had been a name men feared, and that he would rather become a name one woman could call aloud across a yard. Otto Brandt took over. Otto allowed him to live, not out of kindness, but because Otto Brandt was the kind of man who repaid his debts, and he owed Wesley for 11 years of something Wesley had never even known he had given. On September 1st, at the Labor Day Fair in the yard of the Mirror Lake Community Church, Mrs. Priscilla Wick, 71 years old, returned from Lisbon and went straight from the airport to the fair. Corinne had found her in Lisbon and told her the entire story over the telephone in 40 minutes. And Mrs. Wick had listened to all of it, and then she said that she too had once had a wrist like that when she was 26 years old and that no one had ever asked her about it. She sold the boathouse, the loft, and the strip of dock to Delaney Pike for $1. Corinne filed the New York State Property Transfer Report and the federal gift tax return, and Mrs. Wick signed them in Lisbon and mailed them back. The main house still belonged to her. The boathouse belonged to Delaney, never to Wesley. In the middle of the fairgrounds, Verna Cobb stood in front of the pie table and delivered her judgment. She said the man didn't know how to bake, and that his pie crust was an insult. She said the dog was fat enough already. She said Delaney Pike had a bank account for the first time since she was 24 years old, and that she had opened it herself, and I stood there and watched her do it. She said no one was calling this a wedding. This was a fair. Eat your pie. In the middle of October, at 10:40 in the morning, on that same lawn, Delaney wore headphones and sang the wrong lyrics while scrubbing suds into the back of the 6-year-old black dog, and the man holding the hose was Wesley Rourke. The October sunlight hung lower than the sunlight in June. On the hook beside the screen doorway hung the brass key tied with twine, and beside it, on the same hook, was the black steel ring. He said her name. He said, "I'm at the right house." Delaney removed one side of her headphones. She raised her hand and pulled her left sleeve above her elbow for the first time in 5 years, and she left it there beneath the sunlight, and she said, "I know." A great blue heron lifted from the shallows. The dog shook himself once and soaked them both. This story leaves behind one very simple truth. Respecting another human being doesn't begin with giving them money. It begins with the words, "Would you mind if?" Wesley Rourke could have bought the entire lake, but the only thing that made Delaney open the door for him was those 4 words he spoke at 10:40 on a Friday morning in June. And the second truth is even more important. Helping a poor person doesn't mean paying their debts for them. It means giving them back their own name so they can stand up by themselves, because money creates dependence, but dignity creates freedom. Poverty isn't always the result of laziness. Sometimes it is nothing more than an error code on a screen that no one is willing to explain. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever met someone like Delaney, someone who worked herself to exhaustion and was still trapped by the system? Or have you ever been that person yourself? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear what you feel deep within your heart. If this story touched you, please press the like button, share it with someone you believe needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories every day. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life each day, and true peace. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.